Start that. Madam Chairwoman, members of the board, I have to request an emergency executive session to address matters related to attorney-client privilege. We need to do that before we address any other matters on the agenda.
Do we need a motion?
I would say a motion.
May I have a motion?
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
We have a presentation. Analysis of fiscal year ending June 30th, 2017, audit and review of equity of the respective agency.
Madam Chair and members of the board, we have Stephen Crandall here, who's an independent CPA, who's assisted us in preparing for the audits and also going great lengths of contacting the Auditor General's office as well as the Government Accounting Standards Board to be able to make sure that we are doing the joint venture as is regulated by the various agencies. So I'll turn it over to Stephen to kind of give you a brief overview, and then I'll have a couple of small comments.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. As Dave mentioned, my name is Stephen Crandall, CPA here in Prescott. My company is SC Audit and Accounting Solutions, and we work with numerous nonprofit governments as well as individual clients. And we've assisted with setting up the accounting under CAFMA for the two separate districts. And so this evening I'd like to just give a general presentation to you to give you some ideas behind what the process was for developing the accounting system that's been put in place, and then ultimately at this point has been audited by the two districts auditors and CAFMA's auditor, which is Hinton Burdick. And Hinton Burdick, they're not a firm out of Utah, but they also have an office in Flagstaff. I have a presentation that I'll put up here. I'll give it a little bit more detail to this board in terms of the overall process of a joint powers authority and joint venture accounting than what was provided at the CAFMA level. And I'll pull this up here. Okay, joint powers authority. I think the idea there is that you'll share resources, combine services, and with the expectation that you're going to attempt to lower costs, expenditures, and increase efficiency. That's generally why these are created. In this case, a JPA is a separate legal entity. So I'm going to just put this. There we go. So you have a separate legal entity that is providing services on behalf of the two districts. GASB statement number 14 is what defines a joint venture, as well as GASB 61, and they give us all the authoritative guidance that says when you have two organizations that create this joint powers authority, here's how you should account for them, each individually. And so these are the authoritative guidances that we've utilized to implement the accounting system between the organizations and track the reporting implications for each of the three entities. So one of the big ideas behind a joint venture is that your participants, they're going to maintain an ongoing financial interest in the joint venture, in the JPA in this case. And that ongoing financial interest should be measurable. You should be able to find certain reports that can give you information in terms of your operating efficiency, or if it's the other way around, you may find that things aren't operating as you have intended, but ultimately we want to have the records there in place so that you can make those analysis and those decisions. When we first looked at this accounting project, one of the things that we really wanted to make sure that we did was obtain guidance not only from the literature that's available to us, but we wanted to go a step further and contact individuals that actually work at the GASB office. And so that's what we had done. I had actually coordinated with one of the authors of some of these GASBs to show them, hey, here's these organizations. This is very unique for our community, and really the first one that's been done. And I wanted them to know some of the things that we were looking at and have them provide guidance as far as how we should structure the accounting. The next step that we wanted to look at was at the Auditor General's office, they have an accounting services division that specifically deals with special districts. And so I had made a phone call down to there, and I had gotten in touch with one of their CPAs, and we actually shared the document with them to say, hey, here's this document that we're trying to structure the accounting under. What guidance can you give us back? And do you agree with the GASBs? And so we got that correspondence back from them. But we thought that was important because this is a unique arrangement, especially to our community. We wanted to make sure that we have all the parties at least involved where we could. And I think that's important at this point, to be able to have their guidance as we were putting this together. One of the first things that happens when you take two organizations and put them together, especially under this document, is that you have an initial transfer of assets of each organization as well as liabilities of each organization to your joint venture, to your JPA. And we had to make sure that we were accounting for each item that came over. And on the surface of the financial statements, you can see the totals, but if you were to drill down to the account level, you would see specific dollar for dollar transfers. You would see fixed assets that were brought over from each organization, and then you would also see liabilities. So you have these two organizations not only are giving their assets, but they're also giving CAFMA their liabilities. So you now are responsible, at least on the books, for their liabilities. And there's a net value of what was initially transferred over. And we were able to capture that basically from the prior year audited financial statements. So we took audited financial statements from Central Yavapai Fire District and took the values of those assets and liabilities, and those were what were transferred into CAFMA. And we've tracked that specifically so that we know what was brought in, and we could specifically go back and identify those. Move on here. In addition to bringing on your initial assets and initial liabilities, one of the key components to joint venture accounting is being able to track the revenues that each organization brings in, as well as the expenses that are brought in from each organization, with the idea of netting those two figures to basically make a determination of your impact on the joint venture. And that's what we had done. And you see, you're using allocation models. In this specific case, what we wanted to do was allocate based on boundaries. To say, well, if you have firefighting personnel that is working in the Chino Valley Fire District boundaries, then that cost would be allocated to Chino Valley as it relates to the cost allocation at the CAFMA level. If you have firefighters that are working in the Central Yavapai boundaries, well, we would allocate those costs to Central Yavapai. And that way we know which organizations are incurring what cost. But again, it comes down to geographic boundaries in many cases. I'll give you an example. If you were to actually look at the general ledger, the detail of CAFMA, you would see station 54, 53, 55, and I might be misquoting some of the stations, but then you'd see water that was used there. You would see utilities that were allocated to those districts. And so again, we really look at the detailed level of each organization to bring this data in. again, it's important to note that CAFMA is wholly owned. It is owned completely as far as the interest that it has. The net position is assumed by Chino Valley and Central Yavapai Fire Districts. They both own the net position or have an interest in the net position that accumulates to 100% of the organization's total assets minus their liabilities in this case. So there's no residual equity in the organization per se. So it all belongs to either one of the two districts based on the contractual agreement and the way that the accounting is set up. And what you'd see is this is just there's an equity interest that each organization will have in a joint venture, and that interest is actually measured on your balance sheet, so that both, in this case, Chino Valley Fire District, they have an investment in the net position of CAFMA. Central Yavapai Fire District has an investment in the net position of CAFMA, and they share that. It's 100%. It's not 50-50, but the combination is 100% of the organization. The idea being that if one entity in a given year was to put in more money than they actually cost, then their equity would go up. If one of the organizations were to put in less than what they cost, well, then their equity would go down. The idea being, that's your ability to separate the two entities from, having to borrow from one another. And again, this diagram here is just basically showing that what we do is we close out the net results each year. So we measure what you've put in, what your cost was. Management goes through a whole process of trying to allocate these expenses by geographic boundaries based on the contract agreement. And there's a lot that goes into it, but it is being tracked. And when you close out the books each year, we present the results of the record at both the CAFMA level as well as at both of the fire districts. And I've mentioned this in earlier presentations, but page 53 of the Central Arizona Fire and Medical Authority's financial statement, it shows a full accounting of all of the assets that were brought in by each entity, liabilities that were transferred, and then your share of the revenues and the expenses that were brought into the organization. And that's the basis for the presentation, and how the accounting was set up. Obviously, this was a process that we were working on for more than a year, and so there's a lot to put in there in a 15-minute presentation. But there are obviously more that can be done as you move forward. I think that there'll be reports and certain analyses that you'll want to look at to really try to measure the impact of each district on CAFMA. And those things are important because when you set out budgets, when you start looking at your levies, you need to know if one organization has to have maybe their levy would be lower, maybe it would go up. In Chino Valley's case, it can't go up. Not with the current legislation. But you need to be able to identify that, and that was our ultimate goal, is to put together an accounting so that you guys can make the proper decisions and really make a determination of the impact of both entities on CAFMA. There was one thing that I don't know if you're requested to point out, is the pension liability that was brought on by the district this year. It shows that the deferred asset of CAFMA based on the pension was up by, well, the deferred asset was like $58 million. But when you're dealing with the pensions and PSPRS, especially when there's a change like this, there are certain timing differences that are accounted for. So this pension asset will actually be amortized over time, and that's explained on page 40 of your financial statements. again, this is a very complex area of the accounting, and the auditors work on this, you know, the pension people down at the state level, they work on this, and there's a lot of guidance and there's a lot of accounting that has to go into it. But, I mean, if you have questions on that, you know, your auditor's available, we're available, PSPRS has guidance, but there's certainly a lot out there on this topic, and it's one of the, probably the more complex areas of accounting that we have to deal with. I'll take any questions if anybody has any.
I have one on the equity portion. Is it possible that if one entity consistently cost more than it brought in, and you keep adjusting that equity down, that it could hit zero and they would be out?
You'd want to watch out for that. I think that's something that, at that point, you'd want to make sure that that's being addressed appropriately at that time.
But we'll
And-
see that each year in the accounting exactly what's
Exactly,
happening
and
with
that's
those
the
equities.
that's the whole idea, is that you'll be able to measure that if that starts to happen.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay.
Chief?
Madam Chair, just as a point of note again, I would strongly recommend to all the board members, as you've received the financial statements, to go through the management discussion and analysis. Specifically on page 10, there's a lot of good financial analysis data on that page that kind of gives you a broad overview of what's going on with the CYFD, including why there was an over expenditure of what we had budgeted by approximately $50,000, which had to do specifically with legal expenses that were above what we had budgeted for. But we had discussed that in a board meeting, so everybody knew about that, and so there shouldn't be any surprises on that. Additionally, as Stephen had alluded to, I think that it's very important to note that 100% of the equity of CAFMA is literally divided up into the two separate entities. So there's nothing that's residually in CAFMA, and CAFMA is a joint venture realistically between the two, so that is allocated back. One of the questions that oftentimes gets presented was, how much money did we save? And I'm going to be upfront and completely honest. Stephen and I have talked about this. From fiscal year 16 to fiscal year 17, neither organization saved money. You didn't reduce your expenses, and in fact, everybody's expenses went up a little bit, which is why we collected more taxes and why we came before the board and said, hey, listen, our budget went up. But if we were to separate and be independent organizations, and we calculated that information, the CYFD was looking at about a $575,000 savings if they were by themselves versus if they were part of CAFMA. And I think that that's important to note, that both organizations, even though Chino Valley saved about $111,000, that both organizations did save money participating with CAFMA versus being on their own. So I think that as time goes on, like Stephen had said, it's going to be important as fiduciary responsibly, as fiduciaries of the organization, to look at and see how much money are you putting in and how much money is it costing you, and are you meeting that obligation, and how much is your equity going down or going up? It may go up year over year, and so that's going to be an indicator then for how the organization's doing and how the funding is going, and what we can plan for financially for the future.
Thank you, Chief.
And something I'll just mention is, I think that we all know this, and I've worked with numerous fire districts even now, and each district, as we're noting, is cost is going up because health insurance expenses are going up and pension expenses are going up. So as far as controlling your cost, I mean, those are the two areas where not just fire districts, but all government entities have to look at those two areas really closely and figure out long-term solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Crandall.
Thank you.
Number 4, call to the public. In accordance with ARS 38-43101H, and as a matter of policy, the Central Yavapai Fire District Board has decided to allow public comment as time permits. Therefore, those wishing to address the board regarding an issue within the jurisdiction of this public body may do so in an orderly manner that includes completing a call to the public and submitting it to staff for the record. If a written statement is being read, please provide a copy to ensure it is entered into the record accurately. Individuals will be limited to speak for 3 minutes, and call to the public shall not exceed 30 minutes per meeting. Before, Suzanne, do we have any?
Yes, ma'am.
Before we begin with those, I'm going to let Attorney Cornelius proceed with legal response to accusation of alleged criminal conduct and of conflict of interest raised during January 2018 call to the public.
Thank you, Madam. Sorry. Oh, it's on. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, members of the board. I was asked to address these issues to respond to the comments made by members of Call to the Public because they were raising legal matters. I think it's important to provide my background to the members of the public so you have a sense of the basis for my response. I am not a police officer or police lieutenant like Mr. Jacobs. I am not an attorney from California with 25 years experience, and I do not have Mr. Jensen's years of experience in personal injury and other matters. My background is as an enforcement attorney for the state of Arizona, which role I took up after I graduated from law school here in Arizona. I further acted in the capacity of an assistant attorney general, initially as a special assistant attorney general in the white-collar criminal division, and thereafter as a full assistant attorney general in the criminal division, prosecuting white-collar fraud matters. I am not going to address allegations of criminal conduct because those matters are not within the jurisdiction of this agency. I will say for the record that as an attorney general working in the state of Arizona, an investigator who discussed a criminal case in public, whether in the form of publications or an open meeting, would have been subject to discipline because until and if charges are filed, that is utterly inappropriate. And that is still the case today. Mr. Jacobs suggested to me during the December 2017 open meeting that he intended to turn those documents over to a prosecuting agency. I think that he can certainly do that. And in the event that he does, the agency will respond as required in the event that that matter proceeds. What I can do, without addressing the actual criminal allegations, is address the factual basis for the transaction itself. I know that Mr. Jensen issued a press release. I think that was in error. I think he corrected it with a second press release, but that still omits some particular facts that I think it's important to make part of the record. This matter arose as a result of a discussion between all of the members of the CYFD board. All 5 members were present. That means Director Page, Director Packard, Director Steele, Director Rutherford, and Director Jacobs. The discussion regarding the particular transaction took place in open meeting as is reflected on the agenda and as reflected in the minutes associated with that open meeting. The instructions given by the board at that time unanimously to the fire chief and the then board chair were to proceed with negotiations in a real estate purchase transaction. This was a transaction handled with an Arizona licensed realtor on behalf of the seller. The form that was used was the standard Arizona commercial real estate contract. The matter was handled through an escrow company. Title insurance was provided. All of those factors were part of the standard transaction. Anybody who has purchased or sold real estate in Arizona or in other jurisdictions, California included, knows that oftentimes, in fact in most occasions, an escrow deposit is required as a good faith offering. In this particular instance, a check was embossed. There were no issues with how the check was embossed. That check looks exactly the same in terms of the signatures as every other check embossed in that manner at that time. I don't know whether Mr. Jacobs has requested copies of other checks issued at the time, but if so, he would see that they look exactly the same. There is no requirement that a particular director on the embossment should give specific authority to do that, especially in this instance where the directors had all been present at the time that the instructions were given. The transaction proceeded to negotiations. The actual contract itself was drafted. The check was issued but was not deposited into the escrow account at that time because the board hadn't approved it. By its own terms, in black letters in the contract, there's an addendum, a specific sentence that's added that says, this contract is subject to approval by the Central Yavapai Fire District Board. It came back to the agency in a special meeting. It was discussed at length, something like 30 minutes in executive session. I can't tell you what took place in executive session, that would be inappropriate, but it was properly agendized, it was discussed in great detail, the parties came out into open meeting, a motion was made by Director Packard, it was seconded by Director Jacobs, and all of the members present at that meeting, there were 4, voted in favor of it unanimously. The individual who was missing was Director Page. Director Page specifically called the fire chief because before he left on vacation, he'd had the opportunity to review the contract itself, including the information about the escrow check. He's well familiar with how those checks are executed. And he instructed the chief to notify the board in public during open meeting that the check and the contract, he would have approved them exactly the same way that the board members did. There is no violation of open meeting law. There is no violation in terms of the financial issues related to the transaction. It is correct. Somebody suggested to me, well, that wasn't out of the regular budget. That is correct. It was out of the agency's contingency funds. The contingency fund is maintained for purchases like this or other emergency matters that require a short window. If the board hadn't wanted to proceed, they didn't have to. They could have voted against it. The circumstances were that the board was advised in detail regarding the source of those funds. It was advised that the transaction would not be consummated only out of funds of the Central Yavapai Fire District, that it was a 2-step transaction, that is, the initial payment was the Central Yavapai Fire District's payment, but that the second payment would come out of CAFMA funds. That is to say, Chino Valley money contributed to CAFMA, additionally made as a payment for purposes of that transaction. That was also approved by the Chino Valley Board, and it was further approved by CAFMA. So, in other words, all of those things were fleshed out in open meeting. I understand that all of these minutes are available. I think that public records requests have been filed for them.
I have to do a point of order. We have this also doubled on the agenda.
It's on the agenda for new business coming out of executive session and C, and that's where we were supposed to have this conversation, not take up call to the public time.
I'm
Okay,
not
I think
addressing that.
I think you've used up your 3 minutes. Thank you very much.
It's not called to the public, Director Jacobs, but thank you.
Well, we started to go with the call to the public, and then you jumped in.
That's correct.
I allowed him.
And let me just be clear for the record. That's because I'm concerned that issues related to the matters I'm addressing may come up during call to the public. Matters related to
Well, then
criminal
we can
conduct.
address it in executive session. Thank you very much, counsel.
No, ma'am, I'm
Thank
going to
you
finish my
very
remarks. Thank you.
Thank you for the explanation.
Matters related to criminal conduct are not properly before the board, and I will not entertain them at this meeting. Matters related to the conflicts, that may be before the board, and I'd like to address that piece now. I think I'm done with the first section. It's been suggested that there are various conflicts of interest, which I face and which the board faces and which it may not be responding to. In connection with that, I think it's important to note that actual written correspondence was provided to both boards related to potential conflicts of interest. It's important to keep in mind that at the time, both boards were unanimous in wanting to move forward, both with the joint management agreement and with the JPA, that is the Joint Powers Authority. So there was no conflict at that time. In the event that a conflict actually arises, those letters, which were approved in open meeting by both separate boards, dictate what my response will be. Further, there is language in the IGA, that is the Intergovernmental Agreement setting up the JPA, which addresses conflicts of interest and how those should be drafted. I want to note for the record, and this was explained to the board, that this was not simply my work. This was after consultation with the State Bar, with the Arizona Attorney General's office, and with outside legal counsel. I have continued to retain outside legal counsel related to matters of conflicts of interest. including at the law firms of Birch and Craftiolo and a woman named Linda Sheely. That name isn't going to mean very much to most of you here. She's the ex-senior bar counsel for the Arizona State Bar. I bet Mr. Jensen knows her name. She has been consulting with me regarding these matters. To date, although the allegation has been raised, no specifics have been offered. And I want to note that over time, these allegations have been raised on several occasions. And again, no specifics have ever been offered. Prior counsel have been involved. When I've asked them specifically for details, I've had no response. So my suggestion is with regard to that, at this stage, there are no conflicts between the board. That's my legal opinion. I've consulted with others to confirm that. If individuals have suggestions that there are conflicts of interest, I suggest they provide those in writing so that I can address them with the board as required. Thank you.
Suzanne?
You have two requests to speak. Larry Jacobs, check issues with CYFD and CAFMA.
And would you give 30 seconds?
Yes, ma'am.
And I do have some handouts for the board members.
Madam Chairman, it looks to me like these are related to the allegations of potential criminal misconduct, and my advice to the board is that those not be considered at this time.
Mr. Jacobs, we will not be hearing from you tonight.
Is that right? This is a public response. This is a new forged check that I plan to bring forward. This isn't anything about the $50,000 check.
Sir, to the extent that you're talking about potential criminal matters, you should take those up with the appropriate investigative authorities as you
And-
suggested you would.
And I appreciate your comments, Mr. Cornelius, but I don't think you're accurate in a lot of your assessments. And I plan to bring some accuracy to them in terms of some of the things that you discussed. And I think you were out of order when you brought those forward. So if I'm not going to be allowed to speak during the public, I do plan on presenting these to the media so that they can put this information out, because I'm appalled at some of the things I'm finding. And I disagree with your assessment too, Mr. Cornelius, in terms of whether or not a person's stamp can be used without their knowledge or without their permission. And that's yet to be seen. I think there's already cases with Timber Mesa and some other issues.
You're out of order, Mr. Jacobs.
Mark Alpert, conflicts of interest serving the taxpayers.
Good evening, board members. Again, my name is Mark Alpert, and yes, I'm a California attorney. I do want to, last time I was here, I did talk about conflicts of interest, and I appreciated the fact that there was a brief discussion of those by your attorney. What concerns me about it is it didn't really get to the nub of what the concern is about. He said there's no actual conflicts of interest. Well, yeah, you guys aren't fighting each other. But the issue is, why is it might you need your own attorney or your own advice? As you've had already explained to you today, the whole purpose of this enterprise, this joint venture, was for you folks to save money, right? That was the idea, the concept, that costs would be reduced. And so the assumption would be, and of course you wanted to be treated, if you're going to be in this joint venture with Chino, you want to make sure you're not subsidizing Chino, you're not paying, in effect, paying for Chino Valley's costs. You want to make sure things are done in a way that's fair to the taxpayers that you represent, right? Well, so I took a look at the joint powers agreement, and I was confident I would find something in there that said, these are the steps or the measures that we will take to make sure that, you know, both Central Yavapai and Chino are financially treated fairly, so that there doesn't, you know, that we don't get into a situation where one party is subsidizing another. And there's absolutely nothing in there about that. You know, another concern or an issue might be, well, what happens if Chino Valley or even Central Yavapai decides they're not going to budget enough money to pay for their fair share of their expenses? Surely we must have some mechanism in our agreement to make sure that Chino does its job, or Central Yavapai. And so I looked through this agreement to find such a provision, and it doesn't exist.
Mr. Albert, your time is up.
That's 3 minutes?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Folks, just to give me a close for a second here. Look, you heard a discussion about how expenses are being saved or avoided. For you guys to really understand what your situation is, you need to get somebody who's looking out for just your interests, Central Yavapai taxpayers' interests, to ask the right questions. Nothing insulting to Mr. Crandall or to CAFMA. Their interests are different than yours.
Your time is
You
up.
need to ask the right questions, and you need to have your own information that is not affected by the different interests and different agendas of different parties.
Your time is up.
Thank you so much for your time.
Madam Chair, I filled out a form. I don't know if there was something that went wrong over here, but I had marked both boxes.
Oh, I apologize for that. I have filed your form away. It does indicate here as well, so like to discuss the same topic as he discussed in front of Catherine.
Quickly. I haven't, well, let the time run out over there. I do have an egg timer.
I know, I see that. You know, while you get that egg timer, I'm just gonna launch right in.
No, no.
Okay, I won't. I'll wait.
Wait.
And I'm not gonna talk about the same things I did in the first meeting because you guys were all here, you heard that. But part of what I listed, what I was gonna talk about was this issue that I see as a flaw in your policy that I think needs to be fixed. Right now, only the chair and the fire chief can put something on the agenda. Did the chair get elected by the taxpayer to a position that could control the conversation? No, you guys all went out, you ran, you're elected, you're on the board. What if, in the future, you get a chair that lacks integrity and has control issues? Any two board members should be able to put something on the agenda. Have a form that could be filled out, signed by two people, and that could be handed through channels, and that item is put on the agenda by two people. I live in Williamson Valley, and right now, I have no representation on the CAFMA board. On your board, I have Vicki Lee, but she can be silenced and not allowed to bring issues to the board that those who elected her want her to be discussed at this board. Please change your policy to allow any two directors in agreement to put something on the agenda. And if you guys have any questions on that, I'd be glad to talk about that. Otherwise, I'm good. Any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Clifton.
Mr. Kuknio, just to clarify, board members can request that items go on the agenda. There's a requirement that we get that at least 3 business days prior to the posting of the agenda so that there's an opportunity to determine whether there are legal issues or other matters that need to be properly addressed. So there is a provision for that, and board members are allowed to do that. If it's a matter that's not properly before the board, because it's outside of the board's jurisdiction, it's not going to go on.
And I get that. So right now, a board member can put something on the agenda, or can the chair say, no, we're not going to talk about that?
It depends on what the subject is.
That's what I'm saying. There
That's
should
really
be a
what-
vehicle where if Matt and Jeff say, we need to talk about this, there's no way that the chair can say, we're not going to talk about it. It ought to be addressed and represent the voters that put them there.
I understand, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on to the consent agenda items. All matters listed under consent agenda are considered to be routine by the Central Area. All matters listed under the consent agenda agenda are considered to be routine by the Central Arizona Fire. What is wrong? Central Yavapai Fire District, and will be adopted by one motion. There will be no separate discussion on these items. Any item may be removed by a board member and will be considered separately for motion, discussion, and action. At the same time, I won't read them, but is there anybody who would like to remove any item?
Madam Chair, I would like to remove item A and also item F for further discussion.
A and F?
Yes, ma'am.
Do I have a motion to approve item B, C, D, and E?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right. Do I have a motion to approve item A?
No, because it's open for discussion. I removed it from the
First,
agenda.
we have the motion, then we have discussion. Do I have a mo- You have a second?
Second.
Okay, now you can discuss.
In terms of the approval of the executive session minutes for October 23rd, 2017, I know we've removed them before. We've discussed that in executive session, where I will not violate executive session protocol by discussing it further in open meeting. But what was interesting is, in the executive session note that we just approved, what I wanted in the October minutes, it was captured in there, so there wasn't the change that was made that I was requesting in the October 23rd minutes.
Suzanne?
We'll have to discuss it in executive
We made
session.
corrections in the October 23rd executive session as directed by legal counsel.
Yeah, but there were specifics that were left out with intention by legal counsel that I requested in. You did put it in the executive sessions for the executive session January 22nd, when I explained what it was that he had said that I wanted in there. It didn't make it to the October minutes, but it made it to the January 22nd minutes that I was discussing. It needs to go in the October minutes before it gets approved, because I will not approve them until so. And I mentioned that in the executive session before.
I understand. We adjusted the minutes according to what legal
Okay,
counsel told us.
but I'm a
because
board
the
member,
detailed-
and he gives legal advice, and I am telling you that he intentionally left information out that is very important. And as an elected board member, I am requesting that it goes in the October minutes. They will not be approved until so.
If I may, Madam Chairman. So I reviewed it in detail. Again, I cannot go into the details of the executive session minutes. But the substance of the discussion is completely accurate, and the nature of the requested change is irrelevant as a legal matter. So I understand Director Jacobs' position. I understand that it's been cleared up in the January minutes. My advice to the board is there's no reason to delay the approval of the October minutes. The requested change doesn't change the legal analysis in any way, shape, or form.
I'm going to call for the vote. All in favor of approving the October minutes, say aye.
Aye. Second. Oh, I'm sorry. Aye.
Aye. All opposed?
Oppose.
Minutes are approved. All right, Director Jacobs, item F.
Item F, the transferring of January's revenue, as I've indicated back in October, November, that I would continue not to pass the money up to the authority due to the fact that you have strictest of our autonomy, and we still do not have proper communication with every director that has been voted by the taxpayers to represent their fire district money. And this includes Chino as well, that are not on CAPMA. So therefore, I am turning that down, and I will not pass the transferring of the revenue. And for the note, I did not pass the budget on this either, so you can't come back and say I approved the budget because there's documentation that said I didn't.
All in favor? All in
No,
favor?
Madam Chair, we need to make a motion. I move that we approve item F, transfer to area revenues from Central Yavapai Fire District to Central Arizona Fire Medical Authority in the amount of $642,566.49.
For a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. All opposed?
Oppose.
All right. Vote to go into executive session. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Attorney Cornelius, you have your direction.
Yes, ma'am, I do.
New business. Motion, discussion, and action regarding joint representation of the CYFD in Superior Southwest by Attorney Ken. Yes.
Yanishevsky. It's like Januszewski, but pronounced Yanishevsky.
Of Virtue, Crackioli, and Ace Hardware litigation. And can I have a motion to approve the joint representation?
Yes, ma'am.
Can I have a motion?
So moved. Second.
All in favor? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carried. Let's see. Item B, I think that's Chief Thorpe.
Madam Chair and members of the board, we're lucky to have still in the audience. Mike LaValle from Stiefel Nicholas and Company to come up and talk to us. Back in 2013, the CYFD Board of Directors came forward and said, hey, listen, there's an opportunity here if we refund or do, if lack of better terms, a refinancing of the outstanding bond funds and to save on the interest rate. And that equated at the time to a little bit over, I think it was pretty close to about $600,000, $575,000, I think if my memory serves me correct, where they saved in bond fund payments and interest. And I think that what we're looking at now is that additionally, there's about $3.75 million that are callable, which means that they are available, that if this board wishes to consider to doing another refunding where we go out to private placement where those bond funds are basically refinanced under a different interest rate. Currently, the interest rate is about 4.25 to 4.75, I think it is. That if we can get a lower interest rate due to private placement, that the board may save the taxpayers additional monies and make it so that they don't have to pay on the bond funds as much as they should have to under our current fee structure. So that's what Mr. LaValle is here to present to you as board members. We're not looking for action, even though it's agendized as such. What we're looking for is basically the presentation, and we'll bring it back at the next meeting if the board wishes to hear more or wants to go forward with it, then we'll bring that back at the next meeting. But Mr. LaValle has traveled up from Phoenix to make this presentation to kind of show you what the potential cost savings are if we do a refund.
I have a few extra copies here. Let me stay here for.
Okay. We can share one.
Thank you, Chief Thorpe, Madam Chair, members of the board. It's a pleasure to be back before you this evening. I say back before you because I was here several years back, and then also at the CAFMA board for Chino Valley Fire District doing the same thing about a year and a half ago as well. So we've had the pleasure of working with Chino Valley Fire for the last 10, 15 years, Central Yavapai Fire District for the last 10 to 15 years, maybe even longer. And again, my name is Mike LaValle. I'm with Stiefel. I'm a managing director. I'm one of 5 managing directors in Arizona. Stiefel is an investment bank, what I call a super regional investment bank. We're headquartered in St. Louis, but they acquired our firm, my predecessor firm, back in 2011-12. But so it's the same group of bankers in Arizona doing the same thing, but now with Stiefel for the last 7 years. We do work all across Arizona. Myself and about 4 other managing directors, we have a staff of about total about 15 folks here in Phoenix. We're Arizona-focused bankers. We work for cities and towns, such as the town of Prescott Valley and Chino Valley. We do work for schools all across the state, including Humboldt Unified, Prescott Unified, Chino Valley Unified. We do work for counties all across the state, including Yavapai County. And I mentioned we do a lot of work for fire districts across the state. Most of the bond elections that have passed for the last 15, 20 years have been our clients of our firm, such as Chino Valley and Central Yavapai. This evening, as Chief Tharp mentioned, prior to the formation of the Joint Powers Authority, Central Yavapai Fire District had bond elections and then sold bonds for new money projects. Years ago, you had taken advantage of low interest rates back in 2013. I'm looking at page 2 of my presentation. This is your outstanding debt. That you have 2 bond issues remaining. I'm going to go from left to right, but you have a 2008 bond issue. That's from your 2004 election authorization. So you sold bonds in 2008. There was a Series B issue. So you had a Series A issue that was refinanced already. That's part of this Series 2013 issue, that second box. So you've already taken advantage of low interest rates back in 2013. That refinancing was about $5.9 million, so larger than this one. The interest rate on that one was about 2.7%. So now we're back to this first box. About the original issue was $6 million. There's about $3.7 million remaining that can be called in if you decide to. The call date is below the first box. You can see the call features. I'm on page 2 here. Callable 7/1/18 at par. So that means you can call in these bonds if you'd like to at your discretion as early as July 1/18 or every interest payment date thereafter going forward, so every 6 months. And I'll talk about timing here in a minute, but if you decide to move forward at this time, you would need to close the issue, meaning come back to the board, take action, have us go out, lock in new interest rates for the new bonds, and close the issue in May or June before the July 1 call date. You can see here that the interest rates on this first box, all the bonds that are highlighted in yellow, they range from about 4 to 4.5%. And we'd be looking to replace them with about, call it 3% money. And I say about, and I'll show you here in a minute. In fact, why don't I take you to page 3. We'd be looking to replace that old debt, the bonds that were in the yellow box there, with new debt at lower rates, and we estimate the market to be somewhere around 3%. We have, if you look at the bottom of page 3 on the left side, their estimated all-in true interest cost, just about 3.1%. That's net of all costs of issuance as well, paying the lawyer, ourselves, and a few other parties to complete the transaction. So the hope is to go out, if you decide to move forward, we would serve as placement agent. Our firm would serve as placement agent. This would be a private placement. We know who the buyers of bonds are out there across the state. Many of them are banks. A lot of banks do direct loans, do loans to municipalities. We have a sheet of about 12 to 15 of them that are interested in local communities. We would, on your behalf, if you wanted us to move forward, put together an information packet, send that out to the various banks out there that are interested in looking at your paper, and have them respond within a 2-week period, as an example, with new terms for a new loan. So for the refinancing. As an example here, this is just an estimate, page 3, the old debt, principal plus interest, is that first column. Okay, so you have about $475,000 a year of debt that you're paying on, that's principal plus interest. You'd be replacing that debt in that first column with new debt, the new refunding bonds, that's the next 3 columns. You can see principal, estimated interest, and again, that's that interest we don't know yet until we receive quotes from banks and lock one in. But we're estimating that rate, including all costs, to be right around 3.1%. Principal plus interest equals debt service, that's your mortgage payment, if you will. So you're replacing the first column, prior bonds, with new bonds, which is the fourth column, which is debt service to debt service. You have savings roughly of $55,000 in the first year as an estimate, and then about $20,000 thereafter per year, for a total of about $250,000. That's if the rate is 3.1% all in. The rate could be lower. Again, we would send out this information packet to a dozen or so banks, try to create some competition amongst them. They're going to be submitting quotes on a date certain. The rate could be lower. So as an example as to how this could work is on page 4. Page 4 on that you'll see the bar chart. That middle bar where it says 0%, that's at that 3.1% rate. That's the savings that we're estimating we might get from a bank plus the cost of issuance. The savings is roughly $250,000. But what would happen if we got a bank rate plus all the cost of not 3.1% but 3%? So if the rate's 10 basis points lower, you can see how the savings will be higher. So if rates are actually lower than our projections, the savings would be higher. So either looking at the chart or the table down below numerically, you can see that if we got rates of, instead of 3.1, say 3%, the savings might be $270,000. If rates are 20 basis points lower, it'd be about $293,000, almost $300,000 of savings. Would that be around 2.9%? Conversely, if we wind up, because the rates move up and down, and until we lock in rates with a bank, if rates trend up, let's say they come back and offer a rate of 3.2%, including costs, all the costs. You can see that the savings would be lower than what we're quoting of 250, be about 227,000. So that's how that chart works. And I just wanted to show you that because until you lock in a rate with a bank, the rates could be somewhere, I'd say, roughly in this range. So with that, what we'd be proposing to do is, just like what we did for Chino Valley Fire on the refinancing, just like what we did with your last Central Yavapai Fire District refinancing, is bringing a resolution to the board, perhaps at if you want to go forward, your April meeting, or potentially your May meeting. And with your permission to move forward, that resolution would dictate terms, outside parameters, not to exceed a certain bond amount, not to exceed a certain interest rate, not to exceed the term. And the other thing I'll mention on the term is we're matching maturity to maturity. We're not extending debt. Okay, so this is basically replacing about 10 years bonds with a new 10-year deal. But we'll have that all in the resolution, and then if you decide to take action on it, that then allows us to move forward on sending out a term sheet or an information packet to the various banks, receiving quotes from them a couple weeks later, having due diligence calls, conference calls with them, and then selecting the best term, selecting the investor, the bank with the best terms, which would produce hopefully the highest taxpayer savings, and then looking to finish and complete the transaction with that bank and close a few weeks later. With the process if we had an April board meeting, we could probably close in late May or early June. And again, that call date is July 1/18. So you could choose to either move forward now, or you could wait, every 6 months, and maybe we could look at this in the fall. Again, it depends on what your view is of where interest rates are, or if you want to tackle this with the savings that's quoted. Savings estimates that's quoted, that's up to you, but I just wanted to bring this to your attention. We do this all across the state, small refundings all the way up to hundreds of $1 million refinancings, so, and anywhere in between. With that, I'll pause, see if you have any questions.
Chief Tharp, I
Yes.
just have a question. How is this going to impact our budget? Because you know in April, we're probably going to be sitting down and discussing budget. Is this going to be all part of that we might want to look at it and have the information prior to the April meeting? Or do you feel that depending upon how interest rates are going between now and then, we want to hold off until the summer months?
So I know that they've been talking from the Fed standpoint that they're basically going to be increasing by, basis points, 100 basis points, 10% basically, potentially every quarter. That hurts us, obviously. It helps the economy, makes it so that people, maybe will start freeing up some money, but it does hurt us in what we're trying to do, which is trying to keep our interest rates lower and have that competition. As far as the impact to the budget, this actually really doesn't have an impact to the budget. What it does do is if we can get a lower bond debt service, that then helps us in the long term for decreasing the overall tax rate that we give to the taxpayers. And as I've stated before, when we end up with a little bit of surplus in our bond debt service account, that's when we kind of lower that tax rate a little bit to help out the consumer, if you will, or the citizen. I think that this is a move in the right direction. To me, I wouldn't want to wait until May or June to kind of see what kind of interest rates we can get at that point, because we're going to then be rolling the dice as to see where the economy is at. We kind of know we're going to have at least one increase that I know of that's going to occur in this quarter, so that'll occur in March. And then we're going to maybe see another one that'll occur before the new fiscal year hits. And so my recommendation to this board would be is in March board meeting we can agendize it where they come back. And keep in mind, this is not an obligation where you guys are, once you make the resolution, that's it, you guys are locked in. If the interest rates come back and they're not as favorable as Mr. LaValle has stated, or they're not as favorable as what you guys even want, then the deal's off at that point. It's not going to be, hey, listen, you guys have to go forward with this. So to me, it's kind of a win-win situation. You have an opportunity to save the taxpayers money if you expeditiously go after it, or you can just kind of not do anything, and you're still going to be dealing with a 4 to 4.5% interest rate over the next 10 years. So.
We're back in March?
Yes, I think we should.
Okay, then we'll bring it back.
And
in
that
March.
gives us time to get with you 2 days.
Yeah,
to cover
absolutely. I mean,
some
I
things.
think that this is I've worked with Mike on a couple of these. It's not foreign to me at all. And I think that, again, this is an easy way for the boards to save taxpayer money. And it does benefit them, just like as we talked about, over $250,000 just in this one transaction.
Yeah, and it's about 3.5 million. Your last one was about 6 million, so you can see why the savings might have been higher on that one. Mainly because you're refinancing more debt. You don't have as much to refinance, thankfully, this time around, but there's still some savings there.
And we're not adding years on to the debt, right? We're just basically doing year for year, so it's still gonna be paid off in the same amount of time. We're just saving them more money.
We're paying it off early, if I remember right.
Well, we're definitely moving in that direction, that's for sure, so.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Mike.
Oh, yes.
Item C, motion, discussion, and action regarding matter of administration building purchase. There will be no action on that item. So I will entertain a motion to adjourn. Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.